Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 13th session of the conference. I'm Komal. I'll be moderating this session. First speaker, there's been a slight change in the order. The first speaker today will be Sushanto from JNU. Sushanto, over to you.
Yes.
Share your screen and
Yeah.
then you can start. So I'll tell you when 25 minutes are up, and then you can take questions.
And just to add that we have Parinita with us, who will be documenting the whole, like as a reporter with us for this session.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it visible?
It's visible.
Okay. Once again, good evening to you all. My topic is actually public expenditure on elementary education, its performance and impacts. Actually, there are a lot of studies. They have tried to capture trends and patterns of public expenditure on elementary education. But very few studies, they have studied the nexus between public expenditure and the outcome of elementary education. And particularly after the Right to Education Act, the studies are very less. So therefore, I have attempted to study in details. The main objective of this study is just to analyze trends in public expenditure on elementary education and the performance during pre and post RTE. Second is to examine the impact of public expenditure on infrastructural development and teacher related and the resultant impact on outcome of elementary education. The third one is to explore the strength of relationship between school infrastructure development and outcome of elementary education. So basically, I have taken 25 states for 3 time points like 2005, 10, and 15. Expenditure data I have taken from the Combined Finance and Revenue Account, that is CAG. And so some of the data not available in the Combined Finance, the online. So I have used the library NIPAP and IEG, Institute of Economic Growth. Gross domestic product from 2004 current prices, and at state national account statistics also I have taken. And total expenditure as usual I have taken from Indian public finance statistics. Enrollment data I have taken from educational statistic at a glance. So at the end, the 18 suggestive educational performance indicators I have taken from DICE. It is published by NIPA. Then the whole performance of school education, I have categorized into 3, like infrastructure indicators, teacher related indicators, and educational outcome. So to study the performance of elementary education, index value has been estimated using the weights which is obtained from PCA, principal component analysis. And the study impacts both cross-sectional and panel regression are being used. So before we go for analyzing the data, the nature of the data is like this. Some data are school with boundary walls like positive, negative, or this is the nature of the data. This performance of 18 indicators has been categorized into this type. Now the estimation procedure, the principal component analysis was used to get the weights. Before going for using this or computing this, we need to have some of the following methods, like first classification. So I already mentioned you all that 18 indicators have been classified into 3. Second is converting raw data into normalized value, because some of the data are positive and some of the data are negative by nature. So we need to have to normalize the data before going for analysis. So these are the people also, they have supported and used the normalization. So there are different types of normalization, but I have used the minimum maximum methods, which has been used by these authors also as well. Then estimation procedures, I said you when we take minimum maximum methods, the best value is best. We have to find out the best value and the worst value in every. The best value in positive sense, we take highest value, but in the negative nature, the lowest value, we take the best value. So these are the methoding. Then assignments of weights. and you then calculating the index value. I have used this. The first components were extracted and each component was multiplied with the respective eigenvalues and averaged in and generated weights. After determining the weights, following formula was used to compute the index value. So now I just said you people with both cross-sectional regression and panel data has been used. Cross-sectional for preliminary exercise to understand the impact of public expenditure on outcome of school education, and then for supporting that, panel regression also is made. So now I straight go to the results. Now before we go for the panel regression, I have made the descriptive analysis, like the public expenditure has been calculated into three, like share of expenditure on elementary education in gross domestic product, in total educational outcome, and per student expenditure. When we talk about these three, we can see that the result shows that expenditure on elementary education as NSDP has increased. There has been also increase in percentage share of in total expenditure, in total budget, and per capita expenditure also increased. So in 3 time points, we see that they have risen, they have increased. So this is then we talk about the whole total of performance indicators. Like these are the indicators. We can see that first of all, school infrastructure, when we go, all these variables have increased in 3 time points, and also the student classroom ratio and single classroom ratio have declined, which is a positive sign that there is a development of infrastructure in elementary education. So when we go to teacher related indicators also, we see that there are 2 average number of teacher and female teachers. They have increased in elementary education, but single teacher school and pupil teacher ratio, they have declined. So this also says that there is a improvement in teacher related indicators as well. But when we talk about educational outcome, these 4-5 indicators have been taken. These 4 indicators have increased during the time points, but dropout rate had decreased, but a sudden decline has been noticed in 2015-16. Maybe this is no retention policy, or there is a full 100% enrollment is required. This type of behavior is impacted on this. So therefore the 40% to it has come 4%. So this is also a sign up. So when we talk about expenditure, it has increased, and infrastructure development, teacher related indicators, and outcome of school education also, there is a positive sign, and we feel that they might have impacted on the performance of school education. So when we talk about the index value, I'm just going for index value. So these are the graphs also I have made. So in details, progression educational outcome. This is the performance of school education. So in performance of school education, what do I say is that in elementary education, Meghalaya was the first position, followed by Madhya Pradesh and Tamil Nadu in order. By 2015-16, West Bengal climbed to the first position, followed by Bihar and Tripura. In overall performance of elementary education, Kerala secured the first position, followed by Tamil Nadu and Punjab in the second and third position for both the time points. Most of the backward states have shown improvement and perform better in the various indices for school education. So after understanding the state characteristics in different indices, we have made a correlation between these variables. When we talk about correlation, we can see that most of the dropout rates are negative and significant. That means those variables which we have taken for regression as well, so that might impact, or there is a strong correlation between infrastructure development as well as per student expenditure has been considered as a public expenditure. So there is a significant impact on these variables. When we talk about correlation, then we go to the impact of public expenditure on school education. So I said you already that per student expenditure is there, school infrastructure index and teacher related index. So when we talk about expenditure has positively impacted on girls enrollment as well as gender parity index, but they're all positive, and dropout rate also significantly impacted. That means public expenditure is influencing in increasing girls enrollment and gender parity index and reducing the dropout rate. Apart from that, school infrastructure also is doing significantly in transition rate, but we could not find a positive and significant result in the other variables. But when we talk about teacher related indicators, it is very significant in enrollment cases as well as in the dropout rate cases. In overall, we see that these are the variables are impacting on school educational outcome. So in concluding remark, I can say that in performance of elementary education, it is noted that the development of school infrastructure in elementary education shows an improvement for considered period. And the average number of teachers per elementary education increase. A significant improvement has been recorded in outcome indicators of elementary education. As a whole, it can be observed that school infrastructure, teacher related indicators and outcome of the elementary increased during the study period. So we can say the RT, Right to Education Act, must have an impact on all these performance of school education. State of Kerala holds the top position in overall performance, followed by Haryana, Tamil Nadu, Punjab, and Goa. When we talk about fixed effect estimation, undoubtedly confirms that public expenditure along with infrastructure development increase, the increased number of teachers have played a major role in the outcome of elementary education. Thank you.
Thank you, Sushanto. So we open the floor for questions.
Yeah.
Please, anyone, you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask. So
yeah,
I have a question, Sushanto.
Should I stop sharing?
Yes, you can do that.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. I wanted to ask that. So what are you doing to take care of endogeneity? So, for example, you're saying that Kerala has done the best. It's the top state, but Kerala was anyways doing good, doing really good in education before that. So how does that not confound with whatever you're calling the effect of RTE?
So regarding endogeneity, I have run the both cross-sectional regression and as well as the fixed effect model.
So in the fixed effect model, you're taking state fixed effects.
Yes. So in that all three types of regression, like random effect also. So I could see that similar concept in all these categories. So therefore, I could just say that Kerala and other states are followed by other states are doing well.
So have you considered going below the state level? For example, I mean, since you have DICE data, so you know the school identity, that would be because it could, just as it could be in the case of states, it could be that some schools are already doing better and then just because of the denominator effect. So you can take school fixed effects and also check the same. Can you do that?
I can do in the further, but before that, I could just say that there are some backward states. They are already backward in infrastructural wise or teacher wise. So therefore, they have not come up so much, but they have improved a lot. And as you said that I can go that you are suggesting. that type of regression can be also checked.
Yeah, I mean, you have shown the trends and you've shown comparison between states, but if you want to establish a causality link
Causality.
between that, so for that you will need to go at a like more minute
Yes,
scale
yes.
than a scale fixed effects, right? Because you need to control for unobservables at the school level at least.
Yes, ma'am. That is. Actually, we wanted to do a field-based study, but due to Corona, it could not happen. But
I
let us see.
understand. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Anyone else has a question?
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. I don't see any hand up. So, all right. We can move to the next presenter. Thank you, Sushanto. That
Yes,
was
thank you.
a very
Thank you.
informative presentation.
Thank you so much.
So next we have Tirtha from Center of Development Studies. And Tirtha, you can start sharing your screen and the stage is yours.
Am I audible?
Yes, now you are.
Oh, okay. Wait, I'll
So
share
you're
screen.
starting at 4:32. So, I mean, you can take your half an hour. You have time to spare. So Shanta finished earlier, so you can use that. All right?
Sure. Can you? Is my screen visible? Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's visible.
And is it full screen now?
It's full screen now. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll start.
Yes. Go ahead.
So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to present our paper. This is a work which we are still working on this. So any comments would be very, very helpful for us. So I'll start with the outline of the presentation. I'm audible, right?
Yes, you are audible, Deepa.
Oh,
Yes, yes.
Sure. Thank you. So I'll start with the outline of the presentation. We first discuss the context of affirmative action in India. Then we discuss the objective of the study. Then I move on to discuss the data and methodology, the empirical specification, our results, some robustness tests, and then finally we conclude. So caste structure plays a deep and entrenching role in Indian society. We are all very well aware of how deep the influence of caste structure goes in our day-to-day life. It actually totally defines how people live their lives, what they eat, where they live, whom they marry, how they make their living, what jobs they get into, how much are they paid for those jobs. There are several studies and literature which has looked into these aspects of caste structure, and they've all found that caste-based discrimination has actually led to a skewed representation of the marginalized castes in education and higher status employment. There are several studies and literature which has found that marginalized castes are not so very well educated or are not so much employed in higher status jobs. So so to compensate for such historical injustice, India has adopted a quota-based reservation for the dominated castes in government jobs and education. The history of reservation or affirmative action policies, as they are called, goes a very long way back. So the first caste-based job reservation was actually started by the Maharaja of Kolhapur in 1902. In 1921, 50% of government jobs were reserved for non-Brahmins in Mysore. Now coming to independent India, the first such, since independence, we have some job reservation and higher education reservation for SCs and STs, 15% for SCs and 7.5%. This policy was implemented since 1950. The reservation policy for the OBC, the other backward castes, it came much later. It was initiated with the Mandal Commission in 1990. So finally, the job reservation started in 1994 and education reservation policy was enacted in 2008. It's a highly contested policy, these affirmative action policies in India and worldwide also. So the two groups, the main proponents of these policies, they call on to the concept of compensatory justice. That is, because of such historical discrimination, affirmative action policies are required to compensate for such discrimination. The proponents, they would support the idea that that it actually brings in equal opportunities to all applicants, right? And then there are possible potential positive spillovers like peer effect, role model, increasing aspiration. Several studies have looked into it. On the other hand, critics, their point of view is that it does not really benefit the target group. It takes away scarce opportunities from unreserved category. There is a concept of creamy layer and elite capture as well. It's not merit-based, and further it creates intercaste tensions. So what does the literature say on the evidence of affirmative action policy in India? So there are some studies that have looked into the impact of job reservation policy and others into the impact of education reservation policy for the OBCs. Here I focus, most of the literature that I discuss have worked on the impact of affirmative action policy for OBCs, the 1994 and 2008 policy. So studies like Lee, Deshpande and Ramachandran, they study the impact of the education of job reservation, on jobs and education. And they did find that there is some impact, but then the hierarchy, there is still a caste-based hierarchy in the type of jobs and the extent of education that OBCs receive after the policy. Khanna 2020, they found that it has incentivized the candidates who are eligible for benefits from the job reservation policy. They stay in school longer than they used to before the policy. Now coming to the impact of education reservation policy, there's a paper by Bhattacharjee 2019. She finds that education reservation increased college enrollment and high school completion, but then the higher effect was among younger population and those who lived in urban areas. Basant and Sen in 2020 finds a positive impact on enrollment in higher education. They find that the effect was significant only in eastern region of the country. However, to the best of our knowledge, the impact of reservation on education on job outcomes has still not been looked at. So that is what our starting point here is in this paper. So first we look at the impact of education reservation for OBCs on their employment outcomes. Then what we are basically interested in is what type of jobs are they getting because of the education reservation policy, given that they are eligible for higher education now post the education reservation policy. So did education reservation increase the likelihood of OBCs getting sought after jobs in India? Now, is this impact of education reservation different from what the impact of job reservation was? And is there any heterogeneity in impact? We look at heterogeneity in terms of education level. Specifically, we look at what is happening to higher educated beneficiaries, age cohorts, intensity of the quota, history of affirmative action in the state, and gender. So we use 3 rounds of PLFS data, periodic labor force survey data, 1718, 1819, and 1920. It's a nationally representative household level sample survey conducted by the NSSO. So what our sample looks like. So we have 2 questions, remember. One is we are asking what was the impact of education reservation and what was the impact of job reservation. So for education reservation, ideally our sample should be such who were born after 1976. Why? We restrict our sample to those born after 1976 because they would have been 18 plus in 1994 and they would have been eligible for job reservation as well. So basically we are trying to look at the impact of education reservation on a sample which would have already received benefits from the job reservation. While for the job reservation, we do not want anybody in our sample to have to be eligible for education reservation. So we restrict our sample to those born between 1990 and after 1960. Our outcome variable is government or public sector and private sector regular jobs. These are all above 3-year contract regular jobs. And we define our occupations on the basis of NCO category. So we have 2 basic broad occupation categories. The first one is high and mid-level jobs. They are 3 NCO codes: the administrative, executive, and managerial, professional, technical related, and mid-level professionals. While our low-skill jobs are those which are secretaries and clerks, service workers, operators, and laborers. So we have basically 2 broad definitions of occupations that we are looking at. So we use a differential estimation strategy. This framework has been extensively used in literature to control for time invariant unobserved heterogeneity. Our treated group, as expected, are the individuals who belong to the OBC caste group. The time variable, as I said, for the education reservation, they're all those who are born after 1990. Why? Because the policy came up in 2008. So they should have been at least 18 years of age to avail benefits from a higher education related policy, right? So for us, any OBC who's born after 1990 has been given a value of 1, while for our time variable, and 0 if he or she was born before 1990. While for job reservation, we similarly we define it as 1 for those who are born after 1978 because they would have been younger than 18, right, in 1994, and 0 for all those who were born before 1978 because they would have been 18 years before 1994. So the specification looks like this, that our outcome variable is job and or occupation, as I just discussed. And our main variable of interest is the interaction between OBC and time. Time, as I discussed again, is a 0-1 variable, depending on when the individual was born. Other controls that we use are age, square of age, location, that is rural, urban, education, household size, gender, of the individual. Further, we also have several fixed effects. We include state fixed effects, caste-based fixed effects, caste into time, and state interacted with time fixed effects. So these would all control for possible unobservables, which could have affected the castes and at the state level over time. For our heterogeneity, we look at, as I said, we look at several forms, several types of heterogeneity over several definitions. So one would be intensity of the quota. Thing is, different states, although it's a national policy, but the intensity of quota is a state level concept also. States, they fix the intensity of quota at their own level for state level educational and state government jobs. So, that would be one of the. So our hypothesis is that an intensity could actually, higher intensity could actually increase the chances of an OBC getting the job, or other way around, it could also reduce the likelihood of an OBC or a beneficiary getting the job, because the opportunity cost of staying and of studying is high, right? So and so it is highly possible that because the intensity is higher and the likelihood of the OBC is higher to get a lower skilled job, so they might leave higher education, and go for and settle for a low skilled job. So it would be interesting to look at empirically what is the impact of the intensity of the quota. Next, we look at the impact of the longer history of quota, because several states, they had some kind of quota even before 94. So 94 is our cutoff. We have some states which had, like Punjab, Haryana, Bihar, etc., which had implemented some kind of reservation policies before 94. And how did females fare? That is the third heterogeneity that we are looking at. And for that, we interact our OBC time variable with the gender of the individual. So let's start with the parallel trend assumption. For that, let's start with how the plots look like. So these are basically plots of the share of OBCs who got, the first one, for example, is the share of OBC who got government job in the overall OBC population. So as we see that the red line is for the non-OBC and the blue is for the OBC. Similarly, the other two graphs are for different occupational categories in government job. We see that there is a downward decline for both, but we also find there is a convergence over time. And the convergence tends to be, and the scheme, and our x-axis is when were the individuals born. So it is, as we can see, that initially the gap was higher. Over time, the gap has been coming down. Especially for the higher occupation category as well. We can see almost that OBCs have, there is almost a convergence towards those who were towards the younger cohort, those born after 95. So this is how it looks like for the private sector also. Here the convergence is clearer than that of the government sector job. Now, for our parallel trend assumption, we use the same specification, just you control for our previous pre-trend years, and the parallel trend assumption is said to be satisfied when our pre-trend years coefficients, they are not significant. As we see that for most of the cases, they are not significant for occupation 1, occupation 2, for the government job, and occupation 2 for the private job. And for the rest, where we did have some significant coefficients, we tested for the joint significance of these coefficients, and we found that they were not jointly significant. Similarly, for now coming back to the job reservation question, this was for the education reservation result. For the job reservation also, we see that there is some sort of convergence over time. These are people, remember, that born between 1960 and before 1990. So we see that over time there has been, the gap was higher for those who were born in 1960, and the gap has been coming down. And the parallel trend seems similar. We just regress for the past 10 years to see if there was any difference in trend between the treated and the control groups. And we found that there was no difference. None of the coefficients are significant. So setting this, so again, this background where our parallel trend assumption is satisfied, we now come to our results. First, we discuss the results of how the impact of the education reservation compares with that of job reservation. Sorry, how much time do I have?
You still have 15 minutes.
15, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. So now coming to the results for the education reservation, we find, remember here the control groups are those who were beneficiaries of job reservation as well. So over and above the job reservation, what education reservation has actually done, we see, is that it has increased the likelihood of their getting high level jobs. And we see this impact for both government jobs as well as for private jobs. While for the job reservation, we found that the impact was for both high level as well as the low skilled jobs. But the education reservation, what we find, what is interesting is that the control group, or the people who were born before 1990, they were beneficiaries of the job reservation also. So over and above our job reservation benefits, they were still getting, they still had their chances, their likelihood of getting higher level jobs increased by 0.3 percentage points for both the government jobs and the private jobs. Next, we look at what happens to those who were higher educated. So this is a subset of those who completed graduation, okay? So they are all at least graduation, they've completed graduation level of education. Here it is interesting to see that for government jobs, we find a negative significant effect. And for private jobs, there is a positive significant effect. So the positive significant effect for private jobs can be because the likelihood has increased because of post the reservation policy. They are more highly educated, and private jobs are also higher in number. So the likelihood has gone up. Now, coming to this case of government jobs, there could be, why is it that the high and mid-level jobs are showing a negative significant? It is possible that because of the education reservation, our pool of OBCs who have completed graduation has increased, right? But there has been not so much commensurate increase in the high-skilled jobs in the government sector. So the likelihood, it is possible that because of that reason, the likelihood has gone down for them getting a higher or a mid-level job. On the contrary, why we think for the low-level jobs that it is possible that higher educated people, they are less interested in low-level government jobs. Now they're more interested in high and mid-level private jobs. They pay more, or they are ready to wait for a high level or a mid-level government job because they are highly educated. Now, if you compare the impact with vis-a-vis the job reservation story, what you see is that even for highly educated, they only got jobs in the low-level government jobs. There was no positive impact no impact on the high-level, highly skilled government jobs. So what this story tells us that clearly for private sector, their likelihood has gone up, they're getting, and there is no impact on low-level private jobs for the highly educated. So they're all more interested in the private sector jobs and they're getting it. But for the government jobs, the story becomes more interesting because the reason could be different for why there is a negative impact in the high-level jobs and the low-level government jobs. Now we look at what happens over age cohorts. It's possible, right, that that those who just became 18 in the year in 2008, when the policy was just enacted, their benefits could increase for later younger cohorts, right? Because there's a pipeline effect. It's possible that over time, the pipeline of candidates who know that they would get a job and they could prepare themselves for higher education could increase over time. And that is what we actually see, the magnitude of the effect as you go down. Then, for example, OBC interacted with 91, 92 implies OBC interacted with those born in the year 91, 90. They are those, the age cohort, here age cohorts are 2 years age cohort. So they are those who born in the year 91 and 92. As you see that over time, the impact, the positive impact, the size of the impact has gone up. Even for those in the subsample of those who were higher educated, we find that the government sector, it is negative. significant for the higher educated, and the size of the impact has gone up, right? Because as we just discussed, it's possible that the pool is increasing, but there is no commensurate increase in the high quality jobs. And we do not find any negative significant effect for the younger cohorts and the low level jobs as well. But the impact has increased, size has increased for the private jobs for the younger cohorts. It's gone from 0.005 to 0.013, and it is significant at 1% level. For the low level jobs, as you see, for the higher educated, there is no impact at all. There is no increase, because they are more educated and they are likely to get higher skilled or mid-skilled jobs. So in terms of impact, the heterogeneity that we were talking about, that what happens, so we see that there is really no impact on intensity. The first row shows no significant coefficients. However, we do find some negative significant coefficients for the higher educated and the high and mid-level job category. Now, this could be possible because of your maybe it is because of the higher, the negative effect could come from various reasons, as we just discussed, that the likelihood has gone down, or it could be some negative stereotype at the higher level. So that the reason that we're not able to, given the data constraints, we're not able to really pinpoint the reason as to why there is a negative significant effect for the high and mid-level jobs. Now coming to reservation before 94, we see no significant effect for that as well. But again, higher educated, those for the low-level jobs, we do find a significant effect. For the states which had some kind of reservation for a very, very long time, maybe because this again talks about the pipeline effect, these states were had access to some reservation policy way back than other states, and that is why some kind of impact. But however, the impact is only significant at a 10% level. Now for gender, we see that females, they've benefited from reservation, possibly because of the low base effect. Higher educated have benefited more than the overall, higher educated subsample has benefited more than the overall subsample. And we see that the impact size is higher for the government jobs compared to that of your private jobs. Some robustness checks that we do is, first we dropped SC and ST from the sample, because we know that SC, ST, they also had access to some reservation policy since 1950. So if our results are robust, it should be qualitatively similar, and that is what we find in the first panel of our table. And in the second robustness that we do is we randomly define our control and treatment group. So that implies that our treatment group could include both anybody from any caste group, and similarly our control groups could also include anybody from any caste group, and we should not see any impact, and that's what we find, no impact on the randomly assigned groups. This shows that our results are fairly robust across different specifications. Finally, to conclude, our results give evidence of education reservation increasing the likelihood of sought after jobs for OBCs, higher likelihood of private sector jobs as well. Among higher educated, we found a negative impact for government jobs. As we said, that it's possibly because the pool has increased and not so much increase in the number of government jobs, especially high skilled and mid-skilled jobs. Among higher educated, it is possible that they are less interested in low skilled jobs, and because their likelihood has also increased for the higher skilled private jobs. The magnitude of impact is higher for younger age cohorts, some impact of intensity, but it's very limited impact. And we find that females have benefited from reservation policy, as I said, possibly because of the low base effect. That would be all. Thank you.
Thank you, Tirtha. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
I personally found it really interesting. The floor is open for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, or you can just unmute yourself. So meanwhile, I would like to ask a question. So it's a clarification. So you have chosen your age groups such that there is one group that has that could have availed to both the education reservation and job reservation, another one which could have only availed to job reservation. Did you also look at the sample which could not have availed for either? Because if you compare that, then you could have isolated the effect of job education reservation.
Yeah, so that is that we thought of that as well. But the point is, PLFS, no, that gives you a very limited sample to those
I
who
understand.
were, yeah.
Hmm.
So maybe NSS would have been a better data set for that because it covers older. It was conducted earlier, right? Now
Yeah.
the point here, what happens with this PLF NSS is you cannot estimate the impact of look at the impact of education reservation there or compare the job and education reservation. So that's why we had to, we could not look at those who had no reservation at all. However, when we look at, when we look at the impact for job reservation, our control group is basically those who are not getting any reservation for job because
for job,
because,
right? Not getting any job reservation.
And because education came up later, so no reservation basically. Right, because education reservation came up in 2008, right? For the
of course. Yeah. Okay, get
so
it.
the job reservation, our sample is between 60 and 90. Out of that, those born above 78 and higher would be job reservation, and less than not who would be born earlier than 1978 would have got no job reservation. So you can do this 0 and job reservation, but you cannot do a 0 and
with the education one.
And the age cohorts also change drastically, even if you want to do such a comparison. So it's not right to compare someone, say, who's towards the fag end of their occupation, like towards greater than 52 to say 21 to 28 years of age.
Of course,
so that would not be a right comparison. So that's why we couldn't, that's a data limitation. We cannot do that.
Right. If there's no one, another thing I just about the negative effect on the government, higher end government jobs, right? So I was thinking what could drive that.
Yeah, so basically negative effect, what we could think, maybe one way to look at it would be to have more occupational categories to see where this exactly this negative thing is coming up from. That is one way, but I am not sure how much data we would get for each of the occupational categories. That we have to check. But as I said while presenting also, that maybe lower skill jobs, higher educated are not interested so much. Because clearly they can get jobs in private sector, high skill jobs, which are very well paid, right? So then maybe that could be the effect for the lower.
Yeah, that is a possibility. I'm just wondering about higher end jobs.
So yeah, maybe not so much increase in higher level job numbers. So the likelihood
would it be the supply side story? Yeah, because it gets either the entry is pretty stringent or
another
few
thing,
jobs.
Once again, we are again talking about people who are 21 to 28. And they are not the ones who are at the highest level government jobs.
Oh, so in this case, probably you would want to remove them from the sample for this analysis and see that.
Yeah, but then you can't see, the thing is the PLFS, these 3 rounds, what it allows us is our treatment group are those who are born between 91 and 98. Okay. Because that's what the data allows us. So maybe that is one reason. It's possible that that's why they're likely to. But then, yeah, mostly it's also possible that the pool has gone up and the number of supply side story, as you said. So yeah, our data, so we don't know yet how to identify the channel basically. That what is driving exactly this negative story. That we are not, still in process.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
All right, anyone else has a question? Please go ahead. Let's wait for, 1 minute and then we can move on to the next presenter. All right. Thank you, Tirtha. Thank you for your presentation. Our last speaker for the evening is Anunita from Ambedkar University. Anunita, are you here?
Yeah, just one clarification. I'm not from Ambedkar University. I'm an independent researcher based out of Chicago. Niveta Sarkar is from Ambedkar.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. So we have Anunita, who is an independent researcher. Anunita, please share your screen and you can start your presentation. You'll have, so we have plenty of time. So, but 30 minutes would be good.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Am I audible and my screen is visible?
Yes.
Okay.
You can start.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. So to start with my presentation, at the very outset, I would first like to set the context. Despite a substantial growth in higher education system in India, with the gross enrollment ratio of 27.1% as per the latest iShare 2020, the challenges in higher education have increased manifold. And as per Martin Troy's 2006 paper, he has classified, according to his classification, India is with this GER of 27.1%, India is in an initial stage of massification, which is substantially mediated by the private sector. Okay, and there are a lot of anomalies which has given rise, which has resulted because of this mediation, a substantially large mediation of the private sector. One such aspect is also, an additional aspect is also the proliferation of private coaching, which distorts the system by introducing even more layers of variation and many a times adversely impacting inclusiveness, thereby making it extremely pertinent to explore and examine private coaching in the context of higher education. So we see that as per the global education census, it says that the global private tutoring market is projected to reach $227 billion by 2022. And the turn of the 21st century ushered in an unprecedented expansion in the realm of private tutoring, not only in Asia or India, but globally, which was initially centered largely around East Asia. Now, why private coaching? So in developing countries, mostly it is because of low public educational expenditure, large size classes, inadequate number of universities, dismal quality of schooling of public education system, which has been cited as few reasons for the rationale or the reason for private coaching. In developed countries, it is mostly business and profit-making motive and the aspirations of parents, although the aspect of aspirations of parents is predominantly a part of the Indian private coaching institutes in India as well. So what leads us to do this study? What is the rationale of this study? So this so in the Indian context, not many studies have delved into unraveling the various facets of private coaching, with almost negligible research in the area of, specifically in higher education. A lot of studies have dealt with private coaching and schools, but not many in the area of higher education, especially using large sample surveys. So given the gross enrollment ratio of 27.1% in higher education, which is close to massification, it becomes even more pertinent to examine the ever-expanding incidence of private coaching in the level of higher education. More so, if not directly, but it does have, private coaching does have an implicit bearing on quality of education that is being imparted, and it also throws light on the aspect of affordability. Who can afford private coaching and who cannot? And that also creates more division in the whole realm of higher education. So before moving further, I would like to add that this study is still a work in progress. While analyzing the data, a lot of questions emerged, which we were not able to answer conclusively owing to data limitation. So we rather decided, and we intend to use, of course, the feedback from this forum to fine tune our study further. And we also intend to undertake a survey to find answers to the questions which were otherwise ambiguous. So moving on, the focus of the study is what role does individuals, gender, economic, locational aspect, family background variables, type of institution, nature of subject. So gender, we have looked at only at males and females. Economic variable would be since NSS doesn't give us the income of households. So we have used monthly per capita consumption expenditure to be a proxy. Locational variables are regions, north, south, east, and west, and also rural and urban sectors. Family background variables are household levels, household heads, educational level, and the caste affiliations of the individuals. Type of institution would be government, private aided, private unaided, and nature of subjects would be STEM and non-STEM courses. So we would want to unpack the influence of these factors in determining the household expenditure on private coaching in higher education. So we have addressed this question by dividing our analysis into two parts. Part one entails detailing out the descriptive statistics with respect to average spending and proportional representation in private coaching across disaggregations of social groups. Here, social groups, as NSS records the data, is in the form of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward caste, and others. Gender, MPCE, quintile, and type of institute. So these are the level of disaggregations in using which the study has been done. Social groups, gender, MPCE, quintile, and type of institutes. Additionally, descriptive stats, it does help us in unpacking and giving us important insights and information. So, and the second part has delved in estimating a Tobit regression model to examine these factors, impacting expenditure on private coaching in higher education. Moving on to describing the data and the estimation strategy. So the proposed paper has used secondary unit level data from NSS 75th round pertaining to the year 2017-18. And the number of households surveyed in the 75th round was 113,757. And in this study, we have restricted our sample to individuals in the age group of 18 to 23, this age cohort of 18 to 23 years, who are currently enrolled, who are currently attending higher level of education, and who are taking private coaching. So we've restricted a sample in this study to this. Okay, now moving on. So this is the variables that our regression model has used. Our dependent variable is the log of household expenditure on private coaching. And the explanatory variable, as I've already explained, is we want to see the impact of gender, where male is my reference category variable. These are my dummy variables. Female is female. And then for the caste groups of family background variables, we have caste affiliations, ST, SC, OBC, and my reference category is others. For location, we have rural, where my reference category is urban. And then we have the regional locational factors, north, northeast, west, and south. And my reference category is Eastern region. We have taken, to capture the economic level of households, we've taken the log of monthly per capita consumption expenditure. The type of institute, we've taken government institute, and our reference category is the non-government institute. And for family background variables, we have also taken the household heads completed level of education, where the reference category is illiterate level of household heads. And type of subject, we've taken STEM, and the reference category is non-STEM. So STEM is if individual, we've clubbed this for STEM refers to individuals who've taken science, technical, engineering, and medicine. Okay, so now moving on to the estimation strategy. The expenditure on private tutoring, which is our dependent variable, it is 0 for many households. Thereby, it is censored at 0. So we have not used the estimation of OLS. It cannot be used in a situation like this. Thereby, we have used the maximum likelihood method of Tobit analysis for our estimation. And the specification is as follows. The yi star is the latent variable, and yi is the observed counterpart. X is the vector of explanatory variables, and the detail of which I just explained in the previous slides. Beta is the vector of parameters, which one needs to be estimated, and epsilon is the normally and independently distributed error term. Okay, so now, as I said, that the analysis has been divided into 2 parts, the descriptive statistics and the Tobit regression analysis. So first, the descriptive stats, we saw that examining the proportional representation in private coaching in higher education across the explanatory variables, which we've used in our Tobit analysis, one sees, and as expected, the representation of men, the male students from is higher. Students from the non-reserved category of others are more than their respective counterparts as well. Students who have taken up non-STEM courses students who have taken up non-STEM courses have a higher representation in private coaching than students who have taken up STEM courses. However, once we move on to the later slides, we will see how, though the proportional representation of non-STEM courses in private coaching is higher, but their average spending on private coaching is lower. Students in government institute, their proportion in private coaching is way higher than their private counterparts. Region-wise disaggregation shows that students from the eastern region have a substantially large number who are taking private coaching as compared to students, especially who are from the southern region at the level of all India, and also at the disaggregation of rural and urban. If we see students from the eastern part of the country, from the eastern part of India, we see that at the level of all India, 50% of them take up private coaching in higher education, who are currently attending higher education, and the number is substantially high even at the level of rural and urban. However, if we look at this, the widest gap in representation, at least, is seen with respect to students who are in the southern Indian states and who are currently attending higher education. At all India level, that is about 4%. It is across, it is at 4%. So yes, so these are a few important descriptive stats which I just wanted to discuss because this will have a bearing once we discuss the regression analysis. Now, moving on to looking at the average household expenditure on private coaching by social groups and MPCE quintile. The MPCE quintile is a proxy for the income level. So the first quintile is the lowest income quintile in a way. This is a low income group, and as we move higher, like fifth quintile is the highest income group, as we are using MPCE as a proxy for income, as NSS doesn't provide us with direct income data. It is seen that within the higher education category, okay, so before moving on to explaining this, I would just like to bring your focus to one aspect that we came across while analyzing the data. So we had also analyzed NSS 71st round, and in that round, the number of the proportion of higher educated students who are taking private coaching was 19%. That was in the year 2014-15. So while while examining NSS 75th round, which is pertaining to the year 2017-18, we saw that there has been a decline in the proportion of students taking private coaching in higher education. And that has from 19% in 2014-15, it has gone down to 11% in 2017-18. Okay, so what do we see? That it is only 11% who are taking private coaching. So 89% are the ones who are not taking. Though we see that a large section in higher education does not take private coaching, still we felt that it would be insightful to unravel and understand who are those 11% who are taking private coaching. How much do they spend? Thus, in this section, we make an attempt to capture the patterns and cost of private coaching in India at the disaggregated levels of social groups, MPC quintiles, gender, and sector. So on an average, what do we see in this specific slide is that the household expenditure on private coaching is seen to increase as the income level increases, or as the MPC quintile increases. We see that the categories of scheduled caste, they incur the lowest expenditure on private coaching in the lowest income quintile, and the category of scheduled tribe, they incur the lowest expenditure in private coaching in the highest income quintile. The unreserved category, or the advantageous caste group of others, they incur maximum household expenditure on an average across all the 5 MPC quintiles. We see that the difference in average expenditure between others, which is an advantageous caste group, and the marginalized or disadvantageous caste group of ST, we see that this difference in spending, it widens in higher income quintiles even more. There is a gap across quintiles, but this gap in spending, it widens in the higher income quintiles, and it is maximum. And this gap accentuates in the highest quintile, and it becomes about it accentuates in the highest quintile. This could hint at differences in aspirations among caste groups, leading to variability in private coaching spending despite being from the same income category. So despite being from the same income category, we see a divide or a gap in average spending in private coaching. So this could be because of differences in aspirations among caste groups. So moving on to the next slide, where we look at the proportion of total expenditure spent on private coaching. So one sees that the proportion of annual household expenditure incurred on private coaching, it decreases. The proportion now, we see that it decreases with the increase in income groups, implying that the larger burden of private coaching expenditure, the larger burden of private coaching, it falls on the poorer households, disadvantaging this group who have to shell out their scarce resource on private coaching. What also comes to fore is that within an income group, within an income category, there is significant difference among the 4 caste groups that we have taken into consideration with respect to proportional expenditure. This was further validated by the two-way ANOVA, wherein it emerged that there is significant difference among the 4 caste groups with respect to the proportion that is being spent on private coaching. Now, moving on to the next slide, which gives us an idea of average household expenditure on private coaching by gender, location, and MPCE quintile. So what do we see? At the aggregate level of all India and consequent disaggregation at the level of rural and urban, we see that the average household expenditure on males and females, it increases with increase in income quintile, as we saw a similar pattern in the previous slides as well for social categories. Also, between rural and urban sector, average spending on private coaching is higher in urban sector across all income quintiles. So between urban and rural, we see on an average the spending in urban is higher. Now moving on to the next slide, which gives us an idea of the expenditure on private tuition for higher education as a proportion. How much does the household spend with respect to males and females across quintile groups? What one sees is that with increase in quintile groups across males and females. Just like in case of the social groups, the proportional spending on private coaching falls, implying more burden on lower income households. Interestingly, with support from ANOVA results, we see it can be validated that there is significant difference in proportional spending on private coaching with respect to gender as well. Moving on to the average household expenditure on private coaching by type of institution and income quintile, one sees that average spending on private coaching is seen to be the highest, highest in private unaided institutes, only in the highest income quintile, as compared to the government institutions across the level of at the level of all India. Now we see that this aspect, that is average spending in the highest income quintile, is maximum in case of private unaided institutes. This aspect, coupled with the fact that the proportional representation of students who are taking private coaching is maximum in government institutes, which is to the extent of 69%, and in the private counterpart it is about 12%. So though we see that on an average, probably in the highest income quintile, the spending on private coaching is higher in private institutes, but the proportional representation, which is a humongous proportion, it is about 69% students who are enrolled in higher education in government institutes are taking private coaching, vis-a-vis only about say 12% students who are enrolled in higher education are taking private coaching in private unaided institutes. Somewhere this throws light on the aspect of quality and also the aspect of affordability. Probably in private institutes, the out-of-pocket expenditure in terms of course fees is so high that probably students they can't afford to take private coaching, even probably if they want to. However, but when we are talking about quality, one needs to cautiously interpret the aspect of quality, because NSS data has a limitation. It clubs all, it doesn't really help us, it doesn't really talk about the heterogeneity among government institutes or the heterogeneity among private institutes. So not all government or all private is bad. So unfortunately, because of data limitation, we can just intuitively say that it could be an aspect of quality that so many students are taking private coaching in government institutes. However, because of because of data limitation, one can't conclusively say that. Another important aspect that which we came across while exploring the NSS 75th round was, and a very important piece of information which was captured in the NSS 71st round was not, that question was completely omitted in this round, which was the aspect of what were the reasons for the uptake of private coaching. This reason was captured in the NSS 71st round, which was for the year 2014-15. And that showed in the 71st round, it showed that majority students, that is to the tune of 77% of them, they said that the reason that they quoted for taking private coaching was that 77% of them said that they were taking private coaching to augment basic education. So, and within government institutes, this response was 81%. 81% students responded to this reason in government institutes, and 75% responded to this reason in private institutes. So, you know, so this it does reflect something on quality, but unfortunately, this reason was not captured in the 75th round. So, however, we've still said that since it was captured in the 71st round, it still shows a grim reality hinting at quality of teaching across all types of institutes, both government and private. But of course, it cannot be a blanket statement. So unfortunately, we cannot capture or look at the heterogeneity here. So to supplement teaching students who can afford, and it was also seen that to supplement teaching students who can afford, they are the ones who largely opt for private coaching. So that's why we thought we will bring out-
Anurita, sorry
Yeah.
to disturb you. You have 5 minutes left.
Okay. So
Yeah.
now moving on to the regression, the topic result. So as discussed in the descriptive statistics and average spending tables, one sees that at the disaggregation of all urban sector, being a female proves to be unfavorable when compared to their male counterpart in the context of household spending in private coaching. And maximum disadvantage is experienced by those from the scheduled tribe category, which is highest in the rural sector. So being a scheduled tribe lowers the spending on private coaching by a substantial amount of 52, 55, and 44% at India rural and urban sectors respectively. And one sees that with the intersection of disadvantageous caste groups and being a female further reduces the spending on private coaching. For instance, an ST female would spend 69% lower than their others, a female who are in the who have others caste affiliation. Even with the same income group, one sees a huge divide among participation in private coaching. And okay, so and we see that locational differences. I would like to bring this up because we saw that locational differences with respect to region is seen to have a significant impact on spending in private coaching. As already discussed, we see that this could stem from, we see the maximum gap in spending is seen between the southern and eastern region. This could stem from the relatively high concentration of private institutes in southern India, wherein the steep fee structure discourages students from taking supplementary classes as private coaching. It could also imply better quality teaching at these institutes, which negates the need for private coaching. However, one should not misconstrue the interpretation and homogeneously consider poor quality teaching across all government institutes. We see that your income category plays an important role, very significant and important role in your private coaching expenditure. Affordability is definitely an important aspect. So to conclude my study, we see that students opt for private coaching to augment teaching across various levels of disaggregation, as from the study by Mitra and Sarkar, which implicitly throws light on the quality of teaching and learning in higher educational institutions. And we've seen a lot of discrepancies among various subgroups. The choice for uptaking private coaching, it does get constrained largely by various socioeconomic, educational, and locational factors, implying that with quality being compromised, not everyone can afford private coaching to supplement learning, thus becoming an instrument of perpetuating disparities in the realm of education. Yeah, so stringent measure, I think quality is an important aspect, and unregulated expansion of private coaching and creating a relatively more inclusive environment is what is important. So yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anunita. Thank you for that presentation. So the floor is open for questions. Do we have any questions? I have a clarificatory question, Anita. What do you exactly mean by massification of education?
Yeah, so basically, Martin Trau, he classified these according to the GER levels of countries. He classified, there's a specific range. For massification, the range is between 15 to 50% is called massification of higher education. Below 15%, that is called the elite level, as in that is the elite higher education, where higher education is not accessible to a substantial portion of the society. And we have massification, and then above, greater than, and there is another category which is above 50%, which I'm forgetting what exactly that category is called. But yeah, so he classified it into these three categories of the GER being below 15%, GER being 15 to 50% is massification, and above 50% I am forgetting the classification.
Okay. So massification is in general a good thing, like which economies
Okay.
need to strive to, or is it not
Yeah.
as black and white concept?
Yeah. So you're right. So as I mentioned, that massification, GER wise, we fit in that category. It is at 27%. So we are in an initial stage of massification, but we see that a substantial portion of this gross enrollment ratio is being provided by the private institutes and not by the government sector, which is about above 60% of our enrollment of this gross enrollment ratio is from the private sector and not from the public sector. So there are a lot of issues with respect to the funding aspect, because it is mostly
Access and
funded by the
inequality.
household. Yeah, so the aspect of the equality and the representation from the marginalized section. So it has a bearing on that. So that's the sort of anomaly which massification has, especially in the Indian context, which is mediated more by the private sector. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions?
Not a question, but what I have, one second. Not a question exactly, but its study actually poses a lot of ideas, or there could be a lot of policy implications when it comes to education. Because when we look at what is happening in government and what is happening in private sector, somewhere, the whole movement is towards the private sector, the whole privatization of the whole education system. So the whole process of coaching, there are certain examples, certain schools that I've seen what they have done within the school. They have tried to bring in or attach another branch of coaching there them itself, for certain amount. So there are a lot of hybrid models also which are being worked out, where institutions or organizations can make money out of that. But
or the teachers themselves are the ones who are taking coaching, so they're not teaching in schools and then
the most surprising thing that I found, which you said, I was going to talk about it. Those teachers who are teaching in the school, whether it is government or even in private schools.
even in private,
schools, but you will see that they are very effective when they are in the course.
Exactly.
So that is very surprising. How can this ambiguity?
No, in fact, I have heard, like, it's anecdotal, but students have said that teachers don't teach in school because they want you to attend coaching. They don't teach in school on purpose.
And then remember when we were doing our school, like we hardly understood like what tuition was, hardly attended tuition, or it was, for example, if I was weak in maths or something, then it was like, yeah, she will need, because she is weak. It's not
because she's weak. Exactly. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
School is not giving a proper education.
Right.
It is because she is weak in it. So
no, that's very correct. I remember now, because all of us who took tuitions, all of those who took tuitions were deemed as, they are weak in studies. That's why they need additional help.
Yeah.
Either the remedial classes or the tuitions, and not something
it is just
as
a particular subject or something. It's not that if I'm weak in maths, I'm not
taking it across them. Right.
It's not. But now I see it's a full package.
It's
And then the pressure after 10th also, I've seen the pressure of getting into engineering or medical or any branch that they want to choose. That pressure gets created from 10th onwards, So they start thinking the coaching starters when
the Fiji and
I never even studied anything except
the school course. Yeah.
That's a bit,
it's sad.
I don't know where we are moving towards in terms of education. And then with this fourth industrial revolution and fifth industrial revolution, where we are talking about where we need more high skilled, high-end jobs will be opening up. And then, I don't know what kind of pressure and what kind of coaching would come into again.
It'll be like, as you're saying, it's more towards a movement towards organized coaching, where the school itself is, maybe those teachers who were doing it illegally will now be legalized, and that's what they will do.
As in health, where doctors are not allowed, but
exactly, but they have their own private clinics, right?
Yeah. I remember when I was working for an organization in one of the backward districts in Jharkhand. So there was just one tree, and it was registered as it's a government school. and with full infrastructure. And when we went and we saw that school, it was just a tree. Just a tree. I was like, really?
Oh God, that's the level, that's the condition of data.
Yeah.
Now the data, like when we look at the data, the situation is bad, but when the data is bad.
Yeah. And the data is bad, actually.
Yeah. All right. So, so no other questions? Geeta, should we wrap it up?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So, thank you, Tirtha and Anunita and Sushanto. All right. Thank you very much for your presentation.